Well, hey, everybody, this is Julie, and we're missing the blonde today. She happens to be visiting her sweetheart in Indiana. So we are doing an episode without her, but she's here in spirit. I'd like to welcome a couple of people to the episode today, which is really discussing the different types of anxiety and living with anxiety. We have Amelia Slick here. She's actually been on the podcast before, and we also have Zoe Kraus here today. And both of them I had to not strong arm exactly, but maybe encourage, because we're sitting here talking in advance of recording about being anxious about recording. But we are talking about anxiety today. And we thought this would be kind of a good topic to discuss because it's something that definitely affects people in their everyday life. I happen to be close to these two people and can ask them some questions and let them share a little bit more intimately about how the anxiety has affected them and the things that they do in their lives. So with that in mind, I would like to say hello here to Amelia. How are you, Amelia?
Doing so great. I'm so glad to be back so soon. I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to. But
well, I'm so glad to have you back. It's been kind of fun listening to the things that you have to say. And then Miss Zoe Kraus, how are you?
I'm good.
Yeah. Are you apprehensive?
A little bit.
It's okay. We'll be kind and gentle, I promise. So when we're talking about living with anxiety, in conversation, I realized I guess I live with anxiety too. I just happen to have a little medication to help me with that anxiety. So it probably tempers the top portion of it or brings it to a more medium level, but definitely not something I deal with on a regular basis, but can see that in different times that have been rather stressful that it has come out. And I can talk about those examples a little bit later. So Amelia, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay, well, let me just throw a first question at you then. When did you first realize you were dealing with anxiety? What were you experiencing?
I think it's taken different forms throughout the years, not something that I was blatantly aware of in the beginning, just because I think, and we were discussing this off the mic earlier, but everybody has some level of experience with anxiety in the form of maybe just daily stress, which is different, but until it becomes either persistent or severe in nature, it's hard to kind of pinpoint. So I would say I became more aware of it maybe 3 to 4 years ago. Okay. Not that long ago, but had been struggling with it for far longer than that.
So it was kind of an aha moment when you figured out exactly what it is? You're able to put a name to it?
A little bit, yeah. Calling it by its name, I think, is really important just in terms of the first step to making any progress is acknowledging that you have a problem. Yeah. So getting over the shame of that I felt at the time of having that label and just being able to say, you know what, this is what's going on and I'm ready to get help for it was definitely a pivotal moment.
I think you're right. I think there's stigma around anything to do with mental health in general. And this would be a topic that obviously falls into that category. But just like starting out here, I said, hey, I have medication for it. It's like, it is what it is. I'm a human being too. And I have stress in my life and probably take on more than I should at times. Anyway, that I've been able to manage things a little bit that way. But can you remember like some first significant incidents that took place where you were feeling like you were out of control or where the anxiety was really kicking in?
Yeah, I think the only way for me to really acknowledge it, and again, call it for what it was, I had let it build for long enough where it came in the form of something like a panic attack. Okay. So more severe. And with mental health issues, I've found just in talking to mental health providers and therapists that things often go in tandem. It's actually, I think, more rare that somebody just has one thing that they're struggling with, like anxiety. So for me, it was always depression prior to that. And I'd struggled with that since I was probably around 13 or so. So then it started to shift a little bit, or I got this fun added layer of anxiety on top of the depression. Yeah. And some of the early signs feel kind of similar in terms of just feeling not like yourself, or, you know, we can get into some of the more specifics later. But back to your original question in terms of, was there a moment? It was definitely more of a panic attack, severe instance.
How about you, Zoe? Do you remember the first time that you were acknowledging or dealing with what you knew at the time was anxiety, or maybe you didn't even know what it was?
For me, I think that I can remember maybe being 11 or 12, and my mom had noticed that there were bald spots on my head. Just a couple little bald spots, and, you know, went to the doctor and all that stuff. And it turns out I had some form of alopecia, probably stress-induced alopecia, because I haven't dealt with it since. So it's kind of interesting that I was somehow so stressed out that my body was having this reaction. But really what was giving me anxiety was being an 11, 12-year-old girl and having these bald spots on my head and having to make sure that nobody could see them. And, the last thing that I wanted was for somebody to come up to me, one of my peers, and say, hey, haha, you have a bald spot. So it was a lot of, I guess you could say I felt really insecure too. And luckily, eventually, my hair grew back and then it grew back gray. So then I started getting my hair colored, at least just in those spots. And now I'm fine and I don't have
alopecia.
I don't struggle with bald spots anymore, thankfully. Yeah, that's the first time I can really remember feeling that feeling of anxiety. I guess at the time I wouldn't have really put that name to it.
It was all very kind of subtle, understated. The anxiety that you were feeling wasn't necessarily something you could see on the outside. That's what I remember.
Yeah. And it was just felt like, here's another thing that, I have to make sure my hair is in a specific position or bobby pinned a certain way, or when I wear it up or down, it has to be perfect. And I have to double, triple, quadruple check that these little spots are covered. And it was just a constant worry. And I think kind of from there, that's just the first time I can really remember feeling what I know now as the feeling of being anxious. So yeah.
Do you guys both, having kind of started that journey, if you will, knowing, having more awareness around the same time frame, do you feel like, kids are already cruel and they're already so hard around because they're all going through their same things, but do you feel like being around kids or being around people that you couldn't really talk to about it made it worse? Or was there someone that you were able to talk with that helped alleviate some of your stress or not?
At the time, I don't think there was really anyone that I would talk to about it, because again, I didn't really know what it was. So at the time.
Yeah.
So when it first started, feel weird. I also think there's something to be said about the age. You're going through puberty still. Like, I think there's some of that has to do with it too. And also the rise of social media was early 2010s and it started becoming more of a thing. And I definitely think looking back, that probably had something to do with it. And I could not even imagine being a teenager or in high school now.
I know.
In 2023. I think that would be...
No, thank you.
Yeah. So I think there's something to be said about that too.
Like, people nowadays, it seems to be more normalized that people have mental health issues, whatever the case they are. But there's probably more people that I have run across than not that have run into some sort of either depression, and it could be related to different topics, or the anxiety aspect of things certainly plays into and manifests in different ways. We even see it in older adults as well and how they handle things. And I'm thinking about an older adult that we know that is very careful about checking her keys. Like, she checks to make sure her keys are in the same place all the time. She's worried she's going to lose things, that sort of thing. I think that's also a form of anxiety that plays into her daily life. How did you feel like it was affecting your daily life? As you've transitioned now into adulthood and you've been able to kind of call it out for what it is, has it prevented you from doing things that you think you might have enjoyed doing?
I would say without question, at least for myself, yes. And the adulthood piece of it is actually something I hadn't thought about until we started talking through it. But my experience in high school or even end of middle school, we're talking about early teens, you are not in control of your life at all.
Right.
And so I think there wasn't as much language around it. Like you were saying, Julie, it's so much more out in the open now, to where I might have been able to find like-minded people where I could talk to them. But at the time, I didn't have that community or those resources. And so I was in a position of being forced to just having to go through the day-to-day, whether that be a social obligation or school or any of those things. And then when I turned 18 and moved out of the house and nobody was holding my feet to the fire. And at that point, again, it was more depression than anxiety, but the drawbacks and the struggles were still very much the same. I started opting out of way more because I could. It was up to me to make those decisions, and I did not force myself, nor I think would I have been able to. That was a very dark time for me. But in adulthood, it's been a major barrier, particularly socially. If I don't have the energy to at least present the way that I want to, because there are ways to show up even if you are having an anxious day or a depressed day and have people not know.
You have a mask on.
You have a mask on, yeah. And you learn how to do that over time. If I don't feel like I'm able to do that, there is so much internal shame still, even though, again, we know that lots of people struggle with these things. We're trying to normalize it. I just don't want anybody to have visibility into it in that way. So I can talk about it it openly, but I still want to present a certain way. So
that vulnerability, I get that. You don't want to be vulnerable.
Yeah. And again, it's funny because I do feel like I could come on here and talk about what that feels like, but I still want to be able to have energy and chat with my friends and smile and all those things. And if I know I'm going to show up disheveled, looking sad, then
low vibration.
Yeah. I'm sensitive to that. If other people are in that space, I don't want to spread that energy, I guess, for lack of a more sophisticated way to put it. So yeah, when I'm not able to put the mask on, then I don't show up. And that's probably the biggest deficit.
Zoe, do you feel like that's similar for you?
Yeah, I think there's also like you're talking about there's a way to present yourself. A mask you put on, I find that uses up so much, it takes so much energy to do that sometimes I'm like, I could do it, but I don't want to because it can be exhausting. And so, I can kind of relate to that because it's like, I would rather just not go or not do something than to go and not, because these are things that, I want to do and I want to enjoy them, but I usually know that if I won't before I go.
Sure, someone's like there with you, it's different?
Not necessarily. I mean, usually I don't like to flake on plans, right? So if it's something that's already been planned, I will suck it up and I will go and I will usually have a good time. You know what I mean? If it's something that's more last minute or spur of the moment, that's kind of where I tend to opt out quicker, or I'm like, I'm just not mentally prepared for this, or, I'll find any excuse in the book, right? Like, I'm not going to say, oh, I'm just like not feeling it today. I won't say that. I'll be like, oh, I have to do A, B, C, D,
Yeah, because you don't want to hurt someone's feelings either.
Well, yeah, and then
or have them think you're a flake.
And it's kind of the thing too, is you don't want people to stop inviting you to do things.
Yeah.
Because you never show up. That's also something in the back of my mind where I'm like, okay, this is the second or third time I've been invited and I can't, or I won't, I don't want to bail again, I guess.
Yeah. So each of you, what do you do to try to help alleviate some of the symptoms without cooning? Which it sounds to me like that's what happens. You just are like, I am staying home. I don't want to be around other people. I mean, I get like that too sometimes, where you just want to be home. But if it's more often than not, then that is where the problem presents, because you're existing in your life a little bit.
Yeah, I think that being self-aware of how you're feeling and kind of paying attention to how you're feeling is it's easier said than done. You know, oh, just be self-aware. It's much harder to actually do, to pay attention to how you're thinking, like what type of thought cycle is going on today. And for me, there's different things that start manifesting physically, where I can tell that like, I need to do something like to self-care, there's different, self-care isn't always, oh, go to the spa or like eat a good meal. It's also the things that you don't want to do. Like, okay, maybe if I tidy up the space or go and clean the kitchen and get all that done, that can also be self-care.
What did you do in order to get out of that feeling of wanting to just be home all the time?
I just exposure therapy myself. One thing I was going to say before is that when I got my first job, like my first real job, I worked in a restaurant. That was like exposure therapy at its finest, because I had to talk to hundreds of people every day. I was an employee and it was a customer. Yeah, but it was good practice, where you learn how to because that was one of the things I was like, it's kind of embarrassing to admit, but when I was 18, 17, I would be too anxious to go ask like a grocery store employee where something was. I was like, I'll spend 30 minutes trying to find it myself before so that was like that was a game changer for me, was just like working in a job where you had to be social and you had to put a smile on your face, fake it till you make it, But other than that, I really just like forced myself to do things. There's some things that as an adult, you can't not, especially when it comes to like advocating for yourself, like there's some things that you can't skip out on. So whether it's calling the doctor's office to try and explain this and calling your insurance, or you have to be able to speak up for yourself. Otherwise, like you're just out of luck. So I think every time I've done that, it's that wasn't so bad.
Right.
Like, what was I so worried about? And I still remind myself of that now when I have to do things that I'm anxious about doing, or I have to have a conversation that I'm anxious about having. I have to suck it up. I have to force myself to do it. And I'll think of every scenario, every outcome, and I'll probably overanalyze it after too. But usually I would say 90% of the time it's gone well for me. It's worked out, or I went and did something that was out of my comfort zone. And I was like, that was actually really fun. Like I would do it again. And now I've kind of broken a barrier for that certain event or topic. Going to be easier to do it next time. And like, I will want to do it next time because I'll know that it didn't turn out as horrible as I let myself believe it would.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes complete sense. How about you?
I think a lot of the same things that you touched on. Exposure therapy is full and not something that it's like going to the dentist. Like nobody's going to look forward to doing it, and starting small, I think, is important. Don't set yourself up to fail scale. But for me, I try to go or stay within the guise of hope for the best, but plan for the worst.
Yep. Okay.
Always having some kind of safety net. And it's small things that for somebody that doesn't struggle with anxiety might sound a little crazy. Although I hate using the word crazy in these conversations because that's
unusual.
Because I think for people that deal with mental health, we've heard that word in a disparaging way, and I don't like that.
Absolutely.
So for me, it's small things like going to a party or some social event and driving myself there, not structuring things where I'm carpooling. Very small, but it gives me an out if I need it, to where if I do feel anxious, again, planning for the worst, I feel a panic attack coming on, something to that effect, I can just remove myself. I'm not impacting anyone else. I'm not driving them. They're not driving me. And then just prepping in advance of whether it is a work related thing where you have to talk to somebody or have a difficult conversation that you don't want to have, or a social setting, carving out that time for self-care, which again is not a spa day always, but maybe it's just taking time to be completely alone. Like, so I have a partner that I live with, which most of the time provides a lot of comfort. And that can be another form of self-care, is either talking to or spending time with one person that you can trust. And maybe you talk through the scenario before it happens with that person, and that helps prep and make you feel better. But sometimes I also need to be by myself. So maybe I listen to a podcast, some area of the house where I'm alone, or doing some of those things to fill that energy back up. Because Zoe, to your point, I feel exactly the same way, where there are times where I know I have to pull it out, but it is going to drain me entirely. So to the extent that I can charge my battery up to 100% before any of these things happen is just going to set me up as best I can. So again, little modifications, but there are things that I think are helpful to set yourself up for success.
For success, yeah. So let me ask you guys, how have you been able to articulate what's going on with you to the people that are in your life so they understand and so they are supportive? Because, I mean, obviously I'm in Zoe's life and I don't feel like I've been overly sensitive to her sometimes without, and truly it's because I haven't known what to do or how to do it, or I just didn't get it. But how have you both, now that you're adults, because I think it happens maybe more when you're adult where you can advocate for yourself and that sort of thing, like you were saying, Zoe, what have you done to be able to communicate that with the people that you love or the people that are in your life? Or have you?
I think I have fumbled this terribly historically, and I'm working on getting better at it. But getting ahead of it in a calm space, and just, it's hard to find a natural avenue to bring these things up. So if you wait, you may not find that opportunity, but starting to open the conversation earlier on with whether it's a friend or a partner, or, I mean, a family member is a little bit different, but just giving some sort of warning instead of waiting until you have some sort of episode and then trying to explain yourself in that moment, at least for me, is almost impossible. So
that's not the time to be explaining something.
It's not the time.
No.
And frankly, I don't have the words. That's one thing that I figured out, is if anybody that cares about me tries to dig into what's going on with me in that moment, I'm not going to be able to articulate what's going on. And anything that I do say is coming from a place of pure emotion and maybe even fear sometimes. It's not going to maybe even make sense. It's not logical. So I have tried to take it upon myself, once that subsides, to gather myself, come back, and then articulate and just say, in that moment, this is what was going on, as part one. Part two, I'm not going to be able to use my words effectively in that moment. So if this comes up again, this is what I need in that moment. Because I've had lots of experiences where, again, you start to try to have the conversation when you're having a panic attack or something, and they say, oh my gosh, what do you need? How can I help? And I couldn't tell them even if I wanted to. So I think I feel a sense of responsibility to explain as best I can and give them the tools, because the people that care about you are going to try to do everything within their power to help. And if you don't articulate, I mean, there's so many different ways you can approach it, and they're just shooting in the dark at that point. So giving them essentially a set of instructions, I think, is a nice thing to do. But starting to drop those hints earlier, like, hey, you know, big parties for me. I know I talked about this when I was on last, just in terms of social anxiety. Like, sometimes that makes me a little bit anxious, and this is what that looks like, is, I think, a better way to go, or has been in my experience, instead of waiting for something to happen.
Well, I know you are, you're dealing with somebody who I feel like that your partner has his own set of anxiety issues that he doesn't necessarily acknowledge. quite frankly. So when you see that, how are you able to get him to understand, where you're coming from without thinking you're being overly sensitive, or, you know what I'm saying? I don't know the answer to that. I'm just curious. Or can you?
It's a work in progress in terms of we see life through very different lenses. And so trying to pull the other person over to your side and have them stand in your shoes and just get what you're going through in both directions is difficult. So for somebody who claims to not understand it, I mean, unless you've experienced it yourself or are willing to acknowledge that part of yourself, it is something that's, I would imagine, is very difficult to understand, because again, a lot of the things that we talk about around these issues, like for me, not carpooling with someone, for someone that hasn't had that experience, they're not going to get it. That doesn't make any sense. And so, and this isn't just specific to my partner now. I've had other friends in my life, but it's kind of like we're speaking Japanese to each other, and neither of it, you're just sort of looking at the person like, I'm trying, but I don't get it.
Yeah, because I guess that could be like, that example could be perceived as something different. Like you just don't want to be around those people that long. And so you're going to cut out early. And you know what I mean? Exactly. You want to have that control and freedom to be able to do that, but maybe for different reasons.
Right.
Yeah.
And so especially if they're friends or just people in your life that you're not as comfortable with, and you can't have this conversation about, okay, so this is what this looks like every day, and this is one way that I take care of myself, then the perception is that maybe you're a little standoffish, or you don't want to spend the time with them, which is hard to divest yourself of feeling guilt around that or trying to manage that, because there's no way to make sure that everyone is taken care of in those situations.
I asked this, Zoe, because I feel like your partner really gets you. Seems like he really understands. And I feel like maybe it's because he has some of the same stuff going on, but you guys seem to complement each other on that so nicely.
Yeah, I think that the first, again, back to like being aware, that being able to identify that there's a specific situation that's kind of making you feel uneasy, or, sometimes it's not just like, oh, I'm immediately anxious. It kind of boils up, at least for me. And I think just like being able to identify that I'm okay, like that's kind of what's going on with me today. Like there's this thing that's making the situation or whatever that's kind of making me feel anxious is the first step to being able to even talk about it. Because I can't talk about something that I don't know or haven't been able to like step back and be like, okay, like that's what it is. And I have no problem saying like I'm anxious about this, but if I don't, I start getting a little bit snappy or something. Like if it's something I haven't figured out, that I'm like, oh, this is actually like stressing me out, and that stress is making me anxious. It's kind of like a chain of events sometimes. Right. So that's one of my like cues. I'm like, okay, like if I'm acting like this for no reason, maybe there's, like I'm anxious that I have to go do this next week and I have 5 other things to do on that same day or whatever.
Like there's something in the back of your mind that's bothering you.
It's like very subconscious. Right. And it's taken me some time to figure out, but sometimes when I'm expressing and I'm trying to communicate, hey, I'm feeling a certain way about this, I'm feeling anxious, and this is why, it's identifying for myself and, to help my partner. Am I venting, or do I want solutions? Because sometimes I think it's funny. I have to laugh at myself sometimes, I guess, because it makes me feel better. And there's times where I'm like, oh, like I'm anxious about this. And you will go, well, don't be anxious. I'm like, wow, if only you had told me this, earlier, I'm cured. Like,
there's that insensitive mom thing. Yeah.
Well, and it's just like, I get it. And so those are the things too, is that am I venting right now? What do I need? I have to what is the point of me expressing this? Do I need, help brainstorming some solutions, or kind of going over some of the best case scenario, worst case scenario, and some of the things in between? Or do I just need someone to like validate that I'm feeling that way and it's okay to feel that way? Like, you'll be fine. I find that a lot of times I'm not looking for solutions. I'm just trying to get it out, because like saying it out loud helps me process it and deal with it. And then in turn, hopefully get over it. 'Cause like I said, there's some things you just can't avoid doing, or situations that they're just part of life. And, sometimes I'm very surprised by the things that I don't get anxious over doing. And I'm like, wow, I'm kind of surprised that I have no problem doing this. I don't feel any type of way. And there's some things that I'm very surprised that I do feel something, I've done this 100 times before. What's different about this time?
And I do think too, I'm glad you brought up that example or scenario about explaining what you need in that situation, because I think a common mistake that people make who don't struggle with anxiety when they love someone who does is it's almost like a love language in and of itself, but to provide a solution. And it feels like a natural way to like, oh, I fixed it for you. You're welcome. Come in and protect.
Okay, now let's move on to the next thing.
Now let's move on. I mean, it's easier to do that, right? But also, again, it's coming from a place of love. You're trying to help. Often, at least I'll only speak for myself, but because it's not always coming from a place of logic, at least to me, it feels more emotional to dive straight into a solution. One, for an illogical problem doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
You can't logic your way out of it, but it also can sometimes come across as that you're trying to diminish the feeling a little bit. You're not, it's harder to
Does
actively...
it feel patronizing maybe that someone's trying, they're giving you a solution, so you're good?
I think it can feel that way. I know that I can be reasonable enough to know that that's not the person's intent, but it can come off that way for sure. But it just doesn't always allow for really active listening. And sometimes you like Zoe said, you want to get the feeling out and have somebody say, I totally get it and everything's going to be fine. I'm here for you, and almost leave it at that. But it feels like the unsolicited advice can override the space of just having the feeling.
We were talking, I was asking a question earlier about how you feel like this has affected your relationships, and Zoe has brothers, obviously, they don't necessarily get her sometimes, although I feel like as you guys have gotten older, it seems like it's become better. But how have you been able to manage through, or have you, and you're still struggling with managing through individuals in your life who don't get it, who don't understand, who are maybe staying an arm's length away because they don't know what to do?
In a way, I feel like it's to protect myself, but I also know it's kind of like shutting down, is I just don't waste the energy or take the time to try and explain it, because sometimes it feels like, what's the point? I'm a pretty private person in general, so if I can help it, I would like to avoid other people in general knowing that I'm freaking out internally about something. Like, I don't want it to show. So, you said before that you're like, I would have had no idea that you were stressing so hard about this and overthinking and freaking out.
Because she hides things, yeah. And I think we all do. We all put that mask on.
And so I think that it's just like, I kind of just like withdraw. I don't really care to share it. It's not something that it feels like something that's not gonna be productive for anyone. I'll probably leave feeling worse just because I'll feel like, well, I'm trying my best and like you still don't get it, and that's okay. I'm not gonna be a broken record and keep repeating it. And if it's in a situation where it's active, like right then and there, usually people are pretty good at picking up on if you're feeling off or like uncomfortable. At least I feel like I'm kind of good at picking up when somebody else, and that's probably just because I know what it looks like and I know how it feels and I know how I act. So I can kind of see those little cues when other people are feeling that way. I'll probably say something like, I'm just feeling a little bit anxious, but I won't go into detail about why. And most of the time they don't ask. And I just figure it out myself, because I think that it's much easier to share with people who know where you're coming from to a degree.
Or are open-minded maybe about how you're feeling.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm just thinking of like one example. I don't even know if this resonates with you at all, but there have been times when there have been obligatory family gatherings where you love your family. I'm thinking extended family might be in town, that sort of thing. And you've been really anxious about going because there's all these other people there, but you feel really pushed to do it. And this last year, you finally stuck up for yourself and just said, I'm not going.
Yeah. And I think when you get to a certain age, like sometimes it's just my first instinct to like over-explain myself. Sometimes you just don't need to explain yourself. Like, you don't owe an explanation to everyone for everything in so much detail. Like, sometimes it can just be as I'm not feeling up to it. And like, that's something that's also kind of heading into the like setting boundaries side. Cause that's something that when I'm anxious, my boundaries go out the door. I'm like, I'll become like a people pleaser. I become like, because I'm like, I just want to avoid some confrontation and avoid any scenarios that could potentially be uncomfortable, but then long term, it only hurts me. And then I end up being miserable. And why would I do something that makes myself miserable? So as hard as it can be, it's like, sometimes you just got to draw a line and just be like, I don't really need, if they ask why, it's just like, oh, I'm just not feeling up to it this year. Mm-hmm. And it's not even that going necessarily makes me anxious. It's that it's, like you said, obligatory, and like, it's not that it's not fun. but it's just like sometimes I just don't want to go.
For
like,
lots of different reasons.
yeah, it
but-
doesn't have to be because I'm anxious about it, but saying no is what makes me anxious.
Right.
Feeling like I don't have a choice, kind of feeling stuck and trapped. Like if I don't do this, I'm going to piss some people off and then I'm going to have to deal with that on the backside. I'd
Right.
rather just avoid that.
That's happened.
You know?
That's actually
yeah, it's happened.
yeah.
But, you know, like this last year, it was fine. But I also kind of prefaced it as a joke. Like, are you going to be mad at me for 6 months if I don't go?
Yeah.
You know? And so...
Yeah, because that did happen before. And it's because I think not because people are mad necessarily. It's more that they feel hurt, like you don't want to be around them and don't necessarily know why. They just, it's all about how they're feeling, not necessarily what you're doing, but how they're feeling.
Yeah.
So that makes it a little tougher. So what have you done as now you're, again, both adults. So what little things have you found that you've done over time to help you when you feel like something is coming on? Like you feel like, there's a controversy or there's a conversation or, you're applying for jobs and having to interview or whatever the case may do. What can you do or what have you done to help yourself muddle through that?
I think for me that I over prepare, kind of going back to the hope for the best, expect the worst, or
prepare for the worst.
Prepare for the worst. Not expect. I mean, I would hope not. But, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. That's something one of my first therapists said to think of, like, instead of catastrophizing and thinking of only the worst case scenario, you kind of have to, I think of it as finding like a spectrum of scenarios and outcomes and stuff. So definitely like thinking through like, okay, this would be the absolute worst thing that could happen. This would be the absolute best outcome. And, sometimes it's like, as long as I'm okay with it not being the best outcome, but I definitely want to avoid that worst case scenario. So if I fall somewhere in between, I'm going to be pretty pleased. And so I think over preparing, and sometimes it makes it worse, honestly. Like there's only so many, when you plan out like a conversation, or like if I'm having a conversation with Amelia that I'm really like uncomfortable or just like scared or nervous or anxious or whatever, I can't predict what she's going to say.
Right.
So I can predict, how I will respond to something she might potentially say, but then I find that I'm in the situation and I completely blank, or I'm caught off guard and I'm like, well, this is not what I planned for in my head. This is not stick to the script, So I think that preparing or thinking things through, even overthinking, sometimes that's how I think I can kind of alleviate it, is because I'm like, okay, actually all these different, every outcome that could happen, maybe even the worst case isn't that bad. So what do I have to worry about? And I think sometimes there's other things you can do. Like, I've just gone and, like you were saying, just taking some time by yourself, or like sometimes I'll just go for a walk around the block, get some fresh air. I'll maybe take an extra long shower, or different things. Like they have some, things where if you splash really cold water on your face or the back of your neck, it does something. I don't know the exact science, but it's something to do with shocking your nervous system. So you like calm down, or I don't know.
You put like a cold compress on the back of your neck.
You have to physically like splash your face or something with cold water.
Mm-hmm.
It's not pleasant, but it works.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. Yeah. Like I said, I don't know the exact science, but it's something else that
you've done.
Yeah. And then I don't know. I think that there's a lot of little things I probably don't even realize that I do that have just become second nature. One thing that I do is I will run something by someone or multiple people to make sure that I'm like, is this like, do you think this is a good, I mean, you guys both know.
Yeah.
I'm like, should I go this? Should I do it like this? Or should I do it like this? And I'll need a couple people to reassure me that like, this is what you should do, or this is how you should respond, or whatever. And that's something that I'm like, okay, well, if I sometimes just need some reassurance. So it's kind of seeking that out.
Yeah, I think you brought up a couple of points that lend itself to this idea. But at least from my perspective, I think a lot of anxiety is a fear of not having control. So going into a conversation, knowing that nobody's following a script, you're not in a simulation, you have to just roll with it. Or again, going to a party and you don't know if you're going to be able to leave when you want to because you're not the host. You're
not driving.
You're not driving, whatever it is. If I really get down to brass tacks with myself and think about where these things come from, I think that's the root of a lot of it. So framing things in terms of what I can control and trying to let go of the rest, which is way easier said than done, is helpful for me. So a lot of the little things that you were talking about in terms of prepping for something is great. If I can also on the back end realize when I do start to get into that territory of over preparing to where it actually winds me up a little bit more.
Yeah.
That's also something to really pay attention to, because my anxiety is often, it manifests itself as a thought loop. So if you think about being stuck on a merry-go-round, merry-go-round, right? Somebody is, or that's the thing at the playground.
Yeah.
So you're stuck on a merry-go-round. Somebody's spinning you really fast. You can't see anything outside of what's directly in front of you. If somebody's trying to get your attention or talking to you, you almost can't hear them. You can't see anything. Everything's all blurry, right? So you are just stuck in this loop. And to me, that's what over preparing starts to look like. And I can't get myself out of it. And to your point about like splashing cold water on your face, a lot of anxiety, again, and I'm only hoping to speak for myself because I know it looks different for other people. I know when it's coming on when I stop being present in my body and stuck in my own mind. So there are lots of little things that you can do to be more physically present. So whether that's going for a walk, like you said, I find taking a shower or a bath is really helpful. Mm-hmm. And it's a quick thing that you can do that immediately, as a sensory thing, just puts you back in your body. Cold compress is a great one. And there are all kinds of things that my mom reminds me of. And I always roll my eyes and like, okay, yeah, I should stretch. I should go to the gym. Yeah, we're supposed to sweat, whatever. It's a real thing.
There wouldn't be much left of you.
No.
You're such a tiny little thing.
But it's also like, when you're in that spot, the thought of going to the gym is just crippling. I mean, I can't.
Yeah.
It's the last thing anybody wants to do. But I will say it works.
Yeah.
Or breathing exercises is a great one. Again, brings you back into your physical space. And all of these are the most helpful when you do have that awareness that something is coming. Once you tip into a certain space, it's harder to, those little things may not be impactful enough, but if you can stay on top of them, that's what I find helpful.
Have you had a lot of anxiety attacks, Amelia?
I've had,
can you count? Can you count them on one hand, or, is it something where you've had just a few or a bunch?
I would say
I can tell
a handful.
Okay. Because it's like having a heart attack practically.
Yeah. No, you think you're dying. And what's tough is, again, for somebody that doesn't necessarily understand it, you can say all day long, and I've had people say it's all in your head. Like just
literally, it is.
And I'm like, well, no shit. I know where it's coming from. But my breathing is still labored. My heart's still racing. Like the physicality of it is so real. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't matter.
It's not all in your head. It starts to affect your
physical being.
Yeah. Like you said, your heart rate increases. And, I know sometimes for me, it feels like I'm what I would imagine to having an allergic reaction would be like I can't breathe. Like my throat feels like it's closing. And I'm like, I wish this was all in my head. Like, I feel like it would be much easier to combat than feeling like I can't breathe.
Well, it's manifesting physically.
And that's what it does. And I think like the whole, I guess all the things kind of that we talked about is like mindfulness, of getting back into the present moment. And
I know a couple things that you've done to help you with that.
Something too is, you state out loud one thing you can touch, one thing you feel, like physically feel, one thing you smell, one thing and then like all of a sudden you're like, whoa, like that was really
because your mind isn't on it.
Yeah.
Have you had those kinds of panic attacks?
I would say not recently. I think that I do a pretty good job I think that I have more of a constant stream, like a constant level of anxiety all the time versus having like big spikes where I have panic attacks. But when I do start getting that feeling, I feel like I'm kind of in shock. Like I'm confused. I'm like, whoa, like what is this? Like you're supposed to kind of stay at this constant level all the time, not just pop up like this, And I think it's just kind of like, I'm like, okay, let me just pull out my toolbox. What do I know is proven to work? And it's usually one of those things, going outside, getting some fresh air, getting your mind back in the present. And kind of like the worst thing you can do is, for me at least, is try to avoid it and push it down and stuff it in, because then it comes back even bigger and badder than it was before.
And when you least expect it. Because I found the same thing where you are taken aback by it, and knowing that it's only been a handful of times, every single time I can tell you, because they've been such like standout moments, it is because I shoved everything so far down until something, you bend so far that you break. And then all of a sudden you're, I don't know, at a family dinner.
It's just randomly
not
will come up out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Well, I find that when you started bottling things up, it doesn't take as much to pop that top off when it's trying to break out the entire time, when there's so much pressure built. I like to think of when you shake a soda bottle, right? It's been shaken up and it can't fit anymore. anymore. And all of a sudden it's going to burst open, and it's easier to do. Like, I guess you could say it's triggered. Like, I don't like to throw around that I'm triggered a lot. Not somebody look at me, but somebody will say something and I'll take it the wrong way, but I'm only taking it the wrong way because I'm already overflowing with emotion. When I'm shoving things down, I'm more sensitive. And I think that I can all of a sudden, out of nowhere, one little tiny thing that in any other circumstance, or if I was dealing with how I felt, it would be, it wouldn't have much meaning or something, but one tiny thing can all of a sudden like just pop it open.
And I also think we were talking about how that impacts, or how all of this impacts relationships earlier. I think I am a pretty fierce advocate for protecting people that do struggle with mental health issues and come at it from that angle, knowing that I do love people that are not in that position. That can lead to burnout for people too, when there is that sensitivity. And I will be the first to raise my hand and say I am the most sensitive person on the planet already, anxiety aside. Like, my mom described me as a little kid as having my nerves on the outside.
Oh, really?
I'm so aware of everything, to the point where if somebody breathes a certain type of way or something, I'm like, oh my God, they hate me. What did I do? And it's off to the races. So when it comes to anxiety specifically, though, and you have bottled it up, like Zoe was saying, and there is some small, somebody says something, and because you're with your partner all the time, a lot of times that's your partner, and you react some type of way. I think I've had to try to humble myself a little bit and learn to communicate about those things also, and just acknowledge that, hey, that was an inflamed reaction, or, not, here's what I was thinking
overreacted.
I overreacted. But just being mindful of, obviously you need to take care of yourself, but just being aware of how those things impact other people too. And at least holding space in both directions. Like, hey, I want to talk about how I heard that thing that you said and that hurt my feelings, or whatever it is, but also allowing them to say, whoa, yeah, that was a lot.
You don't want to be the person in someone's life who has to walk on eggshells. That's come up with one of my other kids, where he had someone in his life who was struggling with a lot of that. And he felt like he was walking on eggshells because he wasn't sure what to do or how to do it. And he's a very emotional person anyway. He's a very tender soul that way. So I understand, that part of it. I would say for me, I have had 2 anxiety attacks in my life. And one of them, I was sleeping and I woke up. I woke up and I thought I was having a heart attack.
Terrifying.
Yeah, it was terrifying. And there was nothing was happening. I thought maybe I was seriously having a heart attack. I went and had a stress test on my heart and all this stuff. And really what it boiled down to is it was some kind of an anxiety attack. And the other one was when I was going through my divorce. And I very specifically remember what was happening, what I was doing. And it was not anything specific on that day or that time. It was just probably the circumstances around what was happening in my life. And it was just, I had pushed too much down, because you figure, oh, we're strong. We can handle it. I got this. No big deal. That's me. And so of course, the top bursts off at some point, because any human being can't handle everything.
No.
We want to, but we simply can't. So
things stack up,
Yeah.
Completely unrelated things too. I think that if you're just stressed out in one area of your life, that makes your threshold to handle other things a lot smaller or shorter. I think it's like my fuse gets shorter.
Yeah.
When I'm kind of I guess for me, it's avoiding these things, avoiding dealing with them, avoiding talking about them, trying to not feel them. And sometimes that's what I have to do temporarily to get through a situation, is I just got to kind of suck it up and just, we'll say to myself, like, we'll deal with this later. Like, let's just get through this now. And sometimes it can come back and bite me, but
as long as you don't not deal with it later, as long as you're dealing with it, what you say you're going to deal with.
And I think distractions can be, if they're done in a healthy way, again, not a bad thing. If you just kind of get your brain off of whatever scary path that's going down in that moment, that's fine. I think it's important to know, just for yourself, that there are very few quick fixes. And so to seek those out can be dangerous too. So a lot of us...
Are you talking about like self-medicating?
Yeah. So just to make the anxiety in whatever form that comes in, whether it's racing thoughts or something physically happening to you, whatever it is, you might reach for alcohol, or maybe you start smoking. Or I even know people that have articulated that they go shopping in a way that is not healthy. So overspending, even like seeking out sex, anything that kind of falls into that addiction category, I think
it's temporary relief.
Yeah. And I think we're more vulnerable to falling into those traps versus turning to the healthier options like therapy or coming up with a structured routine, making sure you get enough sleep. I mean, none of those are nearly as sexy as, going out and partying.
But it is kind of true. I mean, sleep,
Yeah.
sleep is the one thing, especially when you guys get into being parents, you're going to not have any sleep really for a period of time. I don't mean to scare you, but it is true. You live on much less sleep, and that kind of is the way, I don't know for me, but it's kind of carried on where I'm like, I don't need that much sleep, so I'm fine, and not getting enough, I think directly affects a lot of things, and your mental health is probably the one in particular because you're fuzzy, your head's fuzzy. Yeah. It's like with Zoe's dad, he was working nights for years, and the schedule with the family and then the working nights, he never got a decent amount of sleep in any given day, and then the schedule would flip, and all of a sudden he's not sleeping when he would normally. I mean, it's kind of a nightmare, and no wonder people are feeling foggy when that happens, and that leads to other things too.
Well, that, and I think immediately a shorter fuse.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. That is the first thing to go. But again, even with something like a sleep schedule, it's great if you get to sleep in on a Saturday, but that's not going to fix everything.
Right.
You do have to get on some type of schedule, and that takes time. So when you do get to a place, if and when somebody gets to a place where they're struggling to the point where they need help, that's one of the things that I think is the most frustrating, is that you have to stare down the barrel of kind of a lot of work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's all on you in terms of, again, whether it's therapy or going to the gym or figuring out your sleep schedule, which probably means sacrificing some other things, right? Just to make sure that, okay, I'm in bed every night by 9:30 so I can get up and do whatever I need to do the next day. It's so worth it in the end to take care of yourself and prioritize yourself, but it does take time.
This is kind of a random question, and I don't know if this has any relevance at all, but in the Northwest, we live in an environment that's kind of more gray, which obviously can affect depression, seasonal depression, things like that. Yesterday, we had the first day in 5 months where we were above 60 degrees. It was 62 degrees
great.
out. Oh my gosh, I was like a totally new person.
Oh, yeah.
We were
Reborn.
outside. So do you feel like the weather and the climate and stuff here does impact your anxiety level at all?
I've never noticed it really
Because you're
impacting my anxiety, but like we kind of touched on at the beginning, things come together, like they're package deals. So I think this past season was one of the first winters where I actually was like, wow, like this is taking it, this, the dreary, like the getting dark so early, it's kind of taking a toll on me. Like I kind of feel like I'm actually feeling some seasonal depression this year, and it was kind of weird because it was a first, whereas before it hasn't been so, I guess, obvious to me maybe. But with that, my anxiety kind of increases just because, I'm like, I'm slacking on these things. Things are, blah, blah, blah. So I think that the weather doesn't directly affect it, but it's almost like a side effect of other things that
will affect it,
that the weather and the season kind of bring. It's kind of like just a side effect of something that happens.
I was just curious because I find that when the sun is out, or it doesn't have to be hot or anything out, but when it's sun shining out and stuff, my whole perspective changes on things.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, I feel trapped a bit in the winter because for me, back to that idea, not to continue to go down the path of self-care and over-explaining or articulating that, but for me, that means being outside. So I'm not a gym person as much as I aspire to be, but getting fresh air and moving in, just going for walks or things like that is really important in terms of managing all these other things. And so when I feel like I'm trapped inside for 6 months, I would say conservatively around here, it definitely makes a big difference. And I actually just traveled down to California recently, and it spurred a conversation with my partner and I, because he was looking over, he's like, my gosh, you just look so happy, and the energy, and you've never been more beautiful. My God, you just you're out living your best life. I'm like, I'm telling you, it makes a difference.
Yeah. So I get a text at 10 o'clock at night. Hey, Mom, would you ever move to California?
Yeah, because that was the deal. He's like, well, my mom needs to come with us if that's going to happen. But there is a saying, like, wherever you go, there you are.
Yep.
So would I move to LA and be my best, shiniest self? Like, probably not. Let's be real. Maybe for the first week while I get some vitamin D. But I also don't want to diminish that I do think it makes a big difference for a lot of people. And the depression aspect of the winter is no joke.
Yeah. I think so too. Well, as I'm sitting here planning our family vacation, because all I can think about is sitting by the pool and reading a book and having a margarita. And it being warm. I mean, seriously, I'm obsessed with those thoughts.
No,
because I really just need some sunshine.
No, I feel like a plant that's wilted.
Yeah.
In the wintertime. It's like, I don't think humans are designed to live this way, which is so dramatic because there's no snow. I mean, there's nothing.
Really, it's not horrible.
It's pretty mild.
It's pretty mild.
All of you people that don't live in Seattle that are listening, you're never going to want to move here, right? That's kind of what we're getting at. Just joking.
Yeah, we're not selling it. I'm sorry.
We're not selling it. So I guess if we could wrap this up, I would love to get your top 3 things that you can share that would be helpful for people that are listening to this podcast that might be experiencing some of the same things. Maybe top 3, 4 things that you do. We've talked about them, but let's reiterate that maybe somebody else could take away and try.
Yeah. I would say, just to bring it full circle back to what we talked about in the beginning, just trying to put this out there and normalize what's happening. If this is happening to you, just understand that it's probably at this point, or at least it feels like it's more common than not for somebody to be struggling with something.
Right.
And maybe it doesn't look exactly how it looks for you, but that removing the shame and isolation of feeling like, oh my God, am I going crazy? It's very normal. You're not alone.
I think that's the big one.
Yeah,
you are not
was gonna
alone.
say, as cliche as it sounds, and sometimes I would hate hearing this, but you're not alone, like you just aren't.
And having a good support system, I think, is helpful too. And I know we have, people in our lives that they really just don't understand and they just don't get it. They still love you, but they just don't get it, and they probably never will. And that's something you have to kind of accept, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it's also because there is that shame, even if there wasn't on a society level. I think there's something about the mechanics of anxiety or depression where we just feel or can really terrible about ourselves because of it. And so just be kind to yourself. I mean, if you have a day where you can't get out of bed because you're overwhelmed and dealing with anxiety, that's okay. Don't let yourself be stuck in that, though. There's a time and a place. Exposure therapy is also important. But if you're not around people that are giving you the love and support that you need, try to love and support yourself as best you can through the ways that we talked about. And I guess just to summarize the ideas that I put forward, try to get out of your brain and into your body as much as you can. And that can be in really small ways. Again, going for a walk, taking a shower, doing a cold compress. Just get off the thought merry-go-round.
You have to be mindful, like Zoe was saying,
Yep.
kind of be mindful of and aware of how your body is feeling and what's stressing you out or what's creating that environment for you.
Yeah.
How about you, Zoe?
I think that being able to say out loud, I struggle with anxiety, is probably one of the most important first steps to take. And I also think that you don't need to be having panic attacks every day or so often to seek out therapy. I think that it's just like maintenance for yourself, just like you take your car to get an oil change. Sometimes your brain needs something like that too.
Agreed.
And I think that, if it's something that I think I know it's not accessible for everyone, but I think that a therapist is going to be your best bet to work through some of those things. And like the only reason that I know some of these different things that help me is because I've gone through that process.
Right.
And I think talking about it and being able to talk about it in a safe, protected space, it can be really, really game changing for people. Kind of being able to put a label or identify like this beast you're trying to tame, right? Like, so yeah, I think that just talking about it, whether that be with your family or your significant other or your friends or a therapist or a doctor or whatever, is really helpful. I think we kind of touched on like structure and routine. I think that's really helpful. I hate the idea of routine and structure, but I thrive when I have a good routine. And I know that as much as I wish I could be one of those people that can just not have a routine and not be structured, like I need it. I don't want to need it.
tells me, you don't have any routine. You don't have a structure. And I'm like, my whole life has always been like that.
And some people absolutely thrive that way. I'm with Zoe. I cannot function as a human, but it also, I think the way that we've talked about all this makes it seem like it's a personality trait or something, or like it's such a large part of our lives, which it is, and you do have to make these modifications. But I also think, again, if you're struggling with shame, or again, if you love somebody who is dealing with these things, this is something that is happening to you or to the person that you care about, it's not who they are.
Right.
And so
that's very important to identify and call out.
it is, so that you don't get stuck in a place of not loving yourself anymore, or whatever. Again, that
or being
shame
super hard on yourself.
Being super hard on yourself because it makes everything worse. So
yeah, I would say like one of the most beneficial things you can do for yourself is to kind of cut yourself some slack sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, kind of try your best to not be so hard on yourself and accept like it's okay to not feel okay. It's fine. I'm not going to say it's normal, although like you said, it's more common than not, I think now. And it probably was before. People just didn't either know or they didn't talk about it or want to admit it. But I think just kind of cutting yourself some slack sometimes is one of the most beneficial things you can do to yourself to avoid. And, you know, just practicing, like you said, getting out of your head and back into your body.
And if you are in a position where you feel like the self-medicating is something that you are doing and you don't have control over, you need to get some help anyway.
Exactly. And there's always going to be like a root cause, right?
Yep.
So it's like the reason that you're doing this is because of this. And so we really need to tackle that core root thing in order to not continue in this like addictive cycle.
Right.
Because usually it's drugs and alcohol, I think, you know, is kind of the most common self-medication people do to avoid certain things.
Right. Or to kind of tame the beast, as you
It's
say.
like their coping skill. Yeah.
Coping skill, yeah. Well, I so appreciate both of you being on here today and talking through this with me, because I feel like this topic is something that needs to be discussed a lot more. And in your age group, it's probably a lot more prevalent than people think. And it carries on, frankly, into, you know, your later adulthood as well. And if it's not managed properly, it can really create a lot of headaches and problems and anguish for you as you mature and get a lot older. So have a wonderful day, you guys. I appreciate you being here. And to our listeners, if you are wanting to hear us on any of these, you are welcome to check us out on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok. And we are on the Buzzsprout platform. That's where we place all our recordings, but they go out to all of the different major platforms, the iHeartRadios, Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. So we hope to hear from you, and I will just let us go now. Have a wonderful day, and we will chat with you soon.
Bye.